Okay, AP students, here we go. We're going to start with theories of voting behavior. There are four, and let's start with rational choice voting. Uh, Rational choice means you're just going to make a rational choice. You're voting for a candidate whose platform you most agree with. For instance, I'm a teacher, so something I might be considering when I'm voting are policies that help teachers in education, and that might dictate how I vote. Retrospective voting means when you vote, you focus on the past performance of the candidate. So you're really concerned with their resume. And prospective voting means you are focusing on the policies they promised to deliver. For instance, President Trump promised to make America great again, to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. So those are promises, and a lot of people voted for President Trump because of those promises, and that's prospective voting. Party line voting or straight ticket voting. This is when people vote for a candidate for the party that they associate themselves with, and they vote only for those members. Straight tickets voting or party line voting. You look at the graph over here on the right. This is the instances of ticket splitting. This is when you vote for perhaps a Democratic president and a Republican congressman or senator, or vice versa. And it actually has gone down in recent years. You can see here it reached a peak in 1972. And since then, the instances of ticket splitting has actually decreased. So people are voting more and more party line over time. The election cycle. All right, so there's a lot to talk about here. Let's start with primaries. What are primaries? This is the election of a political party for a political party to decide which candidate will represent them in the general election. Now, each state gets to decide how they will conduct a primary, and we'll talk about that later. So the primary is the initial election to see who's going to actually represent each party in the actual election, which is the general election. So the general election, this is when voters officially select a candidate for office. Happens in November on Tuesdays. So historically, most candidates have been white males, and most of them tend to be from lawyers as a profession. However, since the 1960s, we've seen more and more women in office and more African American office holders, as well as of other minority groups. So you can see the graphs here and see how these numbers have increased over time. We're still not where we probably should be, which would be ideally, obviously, 50% female, 50% male, but these numbers have improved. And again, you can see here the percentages of African Americans serving in the U.S. House of Representatives. Direct primaries. All right, so when I told you earlier that states get to choose how they're going to conduct their primary, there are really two major types of primaries. There's a direct primary and there's a caucus. A direct primary is kind of what you think of when you think of an election. People go to a specific location, they bubble in somewhere who they're going to vote for on a piece of paper, or click a screen on a computer or whatever, and turn in their ballot, walk away. A caucus is slightly different, but before we go there, let's talk about the different types of primaries. There's a closed primary, and in a closed primary, only registered party members can actually vote in that primary. So that means that if there's a Republican primary and it's taking place in Nevada, only members of the Republican Party can vote for that primary. If you're a Democrat or an independent, you do not get to vote for the Republican primary in Nevada. If you're an open primary, like like Texas is, in this case, you get to pick, but you only get to pick once. So if you're a Democrat and choose to vote in the Republican primary, you don't also get to vote in the Democratic primary, and vice versa with that. So you can choose, but you only get to pick one in an open primary. A blanket primary is when voters get to vote for actually both of them. All right, so you get to vote for Democrat and for Republican, and you don't have to pick one or the other. California itself is a top two candidate open primary. So what that means is anybody can choose from a list of the candidates, but the top two vote getters, no matter the party, those are the ones who will actually make the ballot. So there's only two candidates on the ballot, and they're chosen in this primary. So you don't really have a primary being conducted by one particular party. Okay, a caucus. Now, a caucus is they're interesting. Not many states do these. Most states actually choose to use a direct primary. But in a caucus, what happens is you have these regional conventions, these small local conventions. People show up at a school or like a school gymnasium, and they actually openly debate which candidate they should support. And they move around, and by moving, and by you are voting, and so you're actually kind of voting with your feet. So you at the end of these local conventions, they've decided which candidate they're going to support as a regional caucus. They're going to then select delegates, people to represent their regional caucus, and they're going to go to a larger state convention. And at that large state convention, they're going to kind of repeat the whole process, where they're going to again debate with just these delegates. And the delegates, again, will kind of come to a decision on who their state is going to support for the primary. A very active voting style. Incumbents, these are people who currently hold office. We've talked about this before. And we've also talked about incumbency advantages, right? Name recognition. It's easier to fundraise, franking privileges, the ability to conduct favors for constituents and build up support. All these things, these incumbency advantages, make it so it's very difficult to beat an incumbent, and therefore rarely do you see an incumbent actually challenged by a member of their own party in a primary. Okay, primary specifically regarding legislators and state officials. So talking about Senate and the House, and then state officials like a gubernatorial race or whatever. States differ on their voting requirements to select the winner. Again, they have different formats, the open, the closed, whatnot. But they also have different requirements in how many votes it takes to actually win. Some states simply require a plurality, and that just means whoever gets the most votes. It doesn't have to be over a majority, but it could be just whoever gets the most votes. While other states require a certain amount or just simply a majority. So you have to have over half the votes to win. If they have it, so you have to get 60% of the vote and nobody gets that, then they'll have a runoff primary, and that's just a tiebreaker. So if no candidate receives the required number of votes, then in this case, the top two candidates will actually face each other in a separate election, and whoever wins this one will then become the nominee. Presidential primaries. In each state, a presidential candidate wins delegates. So if you look at the map over here, you can see each of these states. This is for the Democratic Party. And you can see Hillary is represented in yellow and Bernie Sanders is represented in green. And so what happens is in each of these states, there's a vote. And based off the proportion, specifically with the Democratic Party, based off the proportion, they walk away with a certain number of delegates. And a delegate is a representative for this state. So Hillary won 333 delegates from California, while Bernie won 206. And over the course of the presidential primary, they build up all these delegates, to which these delegates will then travel to the national convention, and it's at the actual national convention where these delegates will vote, and that vote will determine who will be the nominee for the Democratic Party. Republicans do a very similar thing. Though in some states with the Republicans, it's a winner-take-all, and it's not proportional like you're seeing on this map here with the Democrats. Democrats also do something a little different. They have something called super delegates. They don't wear a cape. They don't fly. They don't have laser eyes. They don't even have a fancy belt that allows them to swing from building to building. But what they are elite party members of the Democratic Party. So we're talking about people who aren't necessarily representing a state. They represent the Democratic Party. So their vote is independent from a state. They don't have to vote the way their state voted. So, for instance, the 333 people who voted, who are delegates for Hillary, are supposed to vote for Hillary. And the 206 from California that are delegates for Bernie are supposed to vote for Bernie. But these superdelegates get to vote however they please. And they can swing a primary. And because of this, what's perceived unfairness that you have these superdelegates that can essentially, make it so Hillary is going to win and Bernie is going to lose, they've actually recently changed the rules. And so now these superdelegates, they have a vote, but they only have a vote in the second round of voting if the first round doesn't come up with a winner. So basically, the superdelegates are now just a tiebreaker. They're almost like the vice president for the Senate. They only get a vote if they have to vote. And again, so the National Convention is where the actual selection is official. However, many times we know what it is before we get there because we can do math. Okay, the Electoral College. So the Electoral College, this is how we select a president in the general election. And we've referred to this all year, but let's get into the nitty-gritty and explain what this thing actually is. So each state chooses its own electors. They have their own process for choosing these electors. They're actual people. Right, the Electoral College is made up of actual people, and it's not a college like, hey, how many units are you carrying this semester? And there's no fraternities or anything like that. It is just a group of individuals who are designated as the electors who get to select the president. So how each state gets their electors is we take the number of representatives that state has plus its senators, which is always going to be 2. And you add that together and you get the number of electors. So California has 53 members of the House of Reps, and they have 2 senators. So they have 55 electors. What this means is every state has at least 3, because you at least have 2 senators and 1 member of the House. So you at least are going to get 3. Let's see, Wyoming over here with their 3 electors. And most states, whoever wins that state gets all of their electoral votes. So here you see that California voted for Hillary Clinton. So all 55 of California's electoral votes went to Hillary Clinton. With Texas had 38 electoral votes, and all 38 went to President Trump. Some states tend to vote either direction. We would call those swing states. Like Florida is a swing state, and Ohio, Pennsylvania, these are considered to be swing states. Whereas Texas tends to always vote Republican, and California always tends to vote Democrat. Whoever gets to 270 electoral votes, that would be the majority of electoral votes, wins the presidency. So you can't just have a plurality to win the presidency. You have to get to a majority. And if no majority is reached, the House of Representatives actually gets to decide who won the presidency. Some critics of this, let's go back here. Some critics of this feel that this is not fair because you can have somebody who wins the popular vote, but not actually win the election, which just happened in 2016. It happened in 2000, and it's happened a few times before that as well. So where Hillary Clinton actually won most of the votes in the country, but she didn't win the required amount of electoral votes. And there are some reasons for this and how that can actually happen. One of them is another criticism of the Electoral College, and that is that smaller states tend to be overrepresented. For instance, Wyoming has 3 Electoral College votes, and they don't really even deserve that many. So one Electoral College vote in Wyoming is equal to 193,000 citizens in Wyoming, whereas for California is underrepresented because one Electoral College vote is equal to 709,000 California citizens. So if you are from California, your voting power is much less than your voting power if you lived in Wyoming. And so some people would point to this as an issue. Others would say that without this, smaller states would be ignored. And that's one of the reasons for the Electoral College. It prevents this regional bias, whereas candidates might just focus on states that have large urban populations, and so therefore the Northeast and the West Coast would be focused on, and the middle of the country would be ignored. However, again, critics then point to that there are these swing states, these states that are battleground states that might vote one way or not. And because of that, candidates tend to ignore states like California and Texas because they vote so often one particular way. So a few criticisms here for the Electoral College, but as of now, this is the system we've got. There's an interesting proposal coming from 11 or 12 states right now, and the proposal is if enough states agree, what these states will start doing is holding off on giving their Electoral College votes and waiting to see who wins the popular vote. And whoever wins the popular vote will get all of their electoral votes, regardless of if that candidate won their state or not. This would effectively neuter the Electoral College and make it more based on the popular vote. But as of right now, there's not enough support for it, but that support is building. We'll see if that continues to build or if this is just a temporary thing. All right, so you saw that electoral map. Here's that electoral map when it's taken into account for population size. And so before, it actually looks like President Trump just destroyed Hillary Clinton. And he did in the Electoral College. If you look at those numbers, he did. But he did lose the popular vote. So if we adjust for the population by state, you can see that this race was a lot closer than it appears by just looking at this map. Because states that only have 3 Electoral College votes are small, but they're even smaller than what they're deemed here because of that inequity. So this map just kind of helps you get a better visual of the voting map than perhaps this one does. Okay, guys, we are going to stop there and look forward to talking to you tomorrow in class. Have a good night.